Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. Fred, welcome to the show.
Hey, Ryan.
So Fred, we've known each other for a few years, but maybe for folks who don't know, I know this is a hard question because on your LinkedIn, you're one of the people who has the best description of what their job title is. It says, or I think it's parentheses, experimenting in life without a job description. So how would you describe what you're doing these days?
It is really hard because I really no longer have sort of one job identity. I'm a father of two young children. I live a pretty quiet life in upstate New York in a wonderful community. And professionally, I've had sort of two larger projects in recent years. One that you might or might not even know about because it's mostly been in French, around the topic of how to communicate with the soul of babies before they can speak. So it's a whole different part of my life. And then probably the part of my life that makes that we are having this conversation is that I published a book in 2014 called Reinventing Organizations that just became this totally unexpected sort of worldwide success, just word of mouth. And has just been a wonderful adventure. And before writing the book, I researched a number of truly outstanding organizations whose founders or leaders were sort of dissatisfied with, the way we're supposed to run organizations, what we're being told in business schools. Like that just didn't feel right for them. They had often done quite a bit of a personal, sometimes even spiritual journey. And from that perspective, we're just relating with people and the purpose of their projects in entirely different ways. And so they no longer wanted to be sort of the lone person sitting at the top of the pyramid. They no longer wanted to be shouting down orders. So there's a whole bunch of things they no longer wanted to do. And then they started really sort of throwing all of that out. And of course, it's easy to throw things out, but then, what do you put instead? Like, what are the practices for people to collaborate in productive ways? What was so striking for me in that research is how extraordinary these organizations were that they, ended up, creating with these new practices and processes they put in place. But also how often strikingly similar these organizations were in their practices, even though they didn't know of each other. And so that really made me feel as if, these different organizations were somehow tapping into sort of the same, whatever you want to call it, perspective, worldview, consciousness that is just emerging at this very moment in time. And that's just been, extraordinary for me to research. And it's made that I look at organizations in a whole different way now. And that's what people tell me very often that we've read the book is like, once I've seen this, I can no longer unsee it, And so I look at traditional organizations in a very different way, like, almost as if they were sort of pathetic or at least in bad need of upgrade. And what's been extraordinary now is just to see that there's just probably hundreds or thousands of organizations that I hear of that, are in the middle of pretty radical transitions and the stories there are just extraordinary.
Yeah, I recently saw a video of you doing an interview with the Dalai Lama. Could you maybe describe how was that experience, just sitting next to the Dalai Lama and trying to explain reinventing organizations to him?
Yeah, as I was preparing this, I was wondering. So this was sort of part of the conference where you're supposed to share, some of your findings and research with the Dalai Lama, and I was just like wondering, like, how do I even talk to, His Holiness, like, hey, Dalai, let me teach you one thing or two about organizations, like, in case you're still running your whole thing a bit autocratically, like, and it was a pretty extraordinary experience. I mean, for one, if I'm really honest, like this is just a wonderful mark of recognition. For me, this is more sort of interesting as a recognition than, whatever, being a Harvard Business Review or, and just he was tired that particular day, but, he asked his translator to translate pretty much everything. So there seemed to be sort of keen interest, even though that's not, particularly his field. And the reception I just received from the audience, there were two standing ovations. I mean, there's just something that happened, 2,000 people in the room and, all these people standing. I mean, there's just something that happened that day that I don't talk often, even though I really like to do it. But I think there's something around this message that is just so hopeful in a time where, we see all of our current systems sort of crumbling and, being at the end of their life cycle. And so I think one of the reasons for this really unexpected success of this book is simply that so many of us are sort of yearning to actually have a little bit of clarity of, what's the way out? What is on the other side? What is the new systems that are currently emerging? And I think that happened that particular morning with the Dalai Lama.
I didn't see at the end of the video, but did he start to respond to your explanation and kind of give some thoughts or opinions on it?
Yeah, I think he was interested by some of the things he was also warning, and I think it's a perfectly valid warning, to think that any model, will fit everyone. It's just deeply part of his thinking, also when it comes to religion, right? That, it's good to have this diversity of religions, right? It's good, that people are where they're at. And so I don't know if he felt that maybe I was presenting this as sort of, this is the only way forward, or this is the only, or if he was just more broadly saying, we have all of these different ways to think and run organizations that I write about in the first part of the book. And each one has had its merits in history. And so I think he was spot on. I'm never trying to convince anybody who isn't already open to seeing this, about these new ways of operating, because to more traditional folks, to more traditional CEOs, this just sounds so radical that it's crazy. Right. And for other people who have been ready for this and who've been suffering with the existing model, they just read it and it's just obvious. They just go like, of course, this is what we need to do. Right. So it's really interesting, depending on how we look at the world, how the same practices can seem totally crazy or just the most obvious thing to do.
I'm curious, it's been 2 or 3 years since the book was out. The first year after was when I first heard about you and reached out. And there's a lot of, I think you had a New York Times article, and I know you were doing a lot of public speaking. I'm curious, in the last maybe year or 2 years, what's sort of been your experience with the longer tail of the book's impact? Have you continued to see it?
Yeah, so, I self-published a book. There was zero marketing. I'm not on social media. So, it was the kind of book that is really doomed for failure, because that's exactly what you're not supposed to do when you self-publish. But I was just lucky that it was picked up by word of mouth. So it never had sort of a wild peak or anything. Actually, the article you're referring to in the New York Times, I think was just in the online edition. And it was the only, so there have been no articles at all in any major publication. So it's just been sort of this steady rise, and it's just now sort of plateaued, but it's staying at the same plateau. So it's not really going down. And now all the translations are coming online, and some of the translations are just selling like crazy because they have traditional publishers who do more traditional sort of marketing and pushing and stuff. So I'm curious too. I'm curious too, how long will this last? I always thought the books have life cycles and this should have dropped already, but it's still going nicely. And it's really strange because, at some level, the majority of people have never heard about it, like in mainstream business, right? It hasn't been picked up on. And at the same time, there's like 200,000 copies that have been sold. And so within circles that are open for it, I think pretty much everyone starts to know about it. And it's almost become, people throw around words like teal and so I do feel that in those circles that are open for it, it has really served a function of changing the narrative from, what was broken with management to what is possible.
Just for folks who don't know, some of the companies, at least in the US, that are particularly Patagonia, I know Buurtzorg in the Netherlands. Are there other companies perhaps that have emerged that you've seen as like, ooh, I could include them if I wrote the book now?
Yeah, there's one or two companies that I like, shoot, I would have loved to hear about them. There's one company that does amazing things in the field of wholeness, how to allow and bring wholeness to the interactions in the organizations and to people. And it's a company in Los Angeles running movie theaters called Decurion that was written about, that I discovered through Bob Keegan at Harvard, who wrote a book that included this company. And there's a number of one or two other ones. There's also just where you are at, maybe you know them. I thought this amazing small book called Sacred Commerce about the gratitude cafes. They're like a chain of coffee shops. They're not afraid of really beautiful sort of spiritually informed practices, but spiritual not in the sense of religious, but simply, how can we honor, what is deepest and most essential in each of us? And this beautiful little book around that. And I also thought hey, too bad that I didn't hear about them. Let me tell you one anecdote, just because I think you'll appreciate that, the Matthew Engelhardt writes about in this book that just blew my mind. And it's one of those things, as often, it's so shocking. And at the same time, so you think about it, it's so obvious, right? So they run these coffee shops, and in one of the coffee shops in the Bay Area, one of the persons working there, obviously was stealing money from the till. So money was, disappearing. And so the founder called a meeting, outside of hours with everyone working there, right? And I would have expected him to say, hey, this is beyond the limits, this is unacceptable, and we have to find a way to deal courageously with this. And what he said just blew my mind. He started by apologizing and saying, I can't believe that with everything we're trying to do, I haven't been able to create a space that is safe enough for a person who's obviously in real difficulties, in real dire straits, to be able to voice that. And that person felt like he or she had to steal money because he or she couldn't talk about. And what a failure on our part that we haven't created a space that is safe enough for people to show up whole and to share where they're at in the difficulties and for us to collectively seek for solutions. This just blew my mind. And, the stealing stopped. Nobody stepped forward to talk about it. But then like a year or two later, a person resigned and said, hey, by the way, at the time it was me. And for all sorts of reasons, I wasn't able to come forward with it. But the stealing stopped. And, everybody, it's just I thought it was just such a beautiful.
I love that story.
But coming back to your questions about, other organizations, what I'm also just excited about is to hear about all these organizations who are in the middle, of fundamental transitions inspired by my book, or sometimes, they didn't need my book, or the book was just one more thing to help them along the way. And frustratingly, some of the really big ones, like there's some organizations, 6,000 people or 60,000 people, who are really doing big things and they don't want to go public about it, which is a bit frustrating for me. For instance, here in the US, there's a Wall Street listed US-based but global manufacturing company that has like 6,000 people. They have something like 60 locations around the world, but they're Wall Street listed, and so they don't feel like they want to go public about it because probably most investors wouldn't understand what they're trying to do. Sometimes it's a bit frustrating. There's a number of organizations in Europe, and there's 60,000, 200,000 people who are doing really radical experiments, and again, they don't want to go public about it, and it's burning my tongue to say more about it. But so that is, I think, an interesting reflection on our times where there's a number, not hundreds, but a handful or two of CEOs of really large organizations who really understand that the system is broken, which I didn't think they were ready for yet. But some of them are really ready to say that. And simply, they feel like the press or certainly the investors would give them a very hard time. So the times are ready and aren't ready, right? So they're ready for all of the privately owned companies, and there's lots of them out there and who feel totally open to talk about it because the owners are happy to talk about it. But when it comes to the big elephants, it's just sort of at this tipping point, I feel.
Yes, it's kind of similar to the B Corp movement where there's larger companies who are looking at it. And there's actually just one company that went public as a benefit corporation. So they now have this legal duty to consider more than just profits when making decisions. And there was a big fear that when they did that, or whoever did it first, Wall Street would punish them because it's sort of like they don't understand a company that would consider more than just profits. But the company's doing fine. It's called Laureate Education. But it's kind of curious that, like you said, we're almost in between two stories. I've been reading, do you know Charles Eisenstein?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. The story of separation, right? Now we're kind of coming to the story of interbeing. Very interesting. How has the election of Donald Trump affected your outlook on life? Do you see this as evidence of, oh no, the shadow is still so strong and we're actually a lot less far along than we thought? Or do you see a silver lining as like, this is just the shadow emerging, but it's necessary to emerge in order to move past it? Or how do you kind of feel?
I had just moved to the United States 2 or 3 months earlier, so it really was a shock for me. And I really felt down for quite a while, so it did affect me, especially knowing that it wouldn't affect me in the sense of, I would probably be one of the last to be affected because, I'm white, I'm self-employed, and, I have all sorts of privileges, quote unquote, right? And so many people would be hurt before I would. But it came on the tail of when I moved here, I started reading quite a bit on race because I wanted to understand, as a white man moving to the United States from Europe, what race is like. And I still plan to read in the same way about Native Americans, and so there are these two sort of huge founding crimes of this country, right? And what struck me reading about race, it was really depressing for me, was to see how this white supremacy and the racism is always morphing. Like every time it looks like there's a victory, it just takes another form, another shape, right? And so I think that was one of the reasons why I was so depressed with the Trump election, of seeing, hey, actually appealing to all of these lowest instincts, there's still all of that base, that is resonating with that. So now if I do take a step back, I do see that there is, I think, sort of an evolutionary value in this of sort of bringing shadow to the light, and that there's real value in just showing how exhausted our systems is, including our democratic system. So this might be a whole different stream, and I don't know how deeply we want to go into that, but just as I sense that we are invited to fundamentally rethink how we manage organizations, I think that democracy as we're practicing it, is past its due date. Just as with organizations, there's all of this experimentation happening all around the world of systems where we no longer delegate our power away for 4 years, but systems where crowd on massive scales can actually come together and make powerful decisions. And I started researching this a little bit. We actually now know how to do these, just like with these organizations, and it works. I think we're just not ready for it from our mental perspective. Or, we're not maybe ready to see that possibility, but the actual systems are robust and they work. And so I think what this just points to is how exhausted the system is, where we are powerless sort of 99.9% of the time, except these few minutes where we vote. And even then, our vote is sort of restrained to Hillary versus Trump. And so in big part, I see what's happening here, but also in Brexit and in many places in Europe as sort of an adolescent rebellion of people that, if they're still treated as having no power, will rebel in stupid ways. And what this is indicating for me is we need to build systems where citizens, can contribute as adults and no longer delegate their power away.
I'd love to dive in that a little bit. So is it direct democracy, large scale decision making? Maybe you could explain more about this idea of we're currently delegating power out for 4 years. What's sort of the systems that you've seen working on maybe a larger scale where it's more direct?
Yeah, I mean, there's stuff happening all around the world. If I take just one piece, for instance, because this is one that's happening in quite a few places in the United States. There's one thing called participatory budgeting that was started in Brazil and Porto Alegre in 1989, and it's the idea that municipal levels, but you can imagine at other levels, the discretionary spending of the budget, so the thing that you can freely sort of allocate, rather than having elected officials decide where it goes, you actually organize something where everyone in the community can contribute projects. People are helped and coached and to flesh out their projects, to present them. And then, everyone who wants to participate puts in their money. So if there's 10 million budget and, there's whatever, in that municipality, 100,000 people living there, it basically means that everybody has $100. So everybody just allocates, and there's some sort of crowd intelligence that happens where the right projects get funded. And, there's now 3,000 cities around the world that are doing this every year. I mean, and it just multiplies and multiplies and multiplies, because what you see is that mayors who do this get reelected every time. Because suddenly, people, feel that they're really part of the whole thing. But basically what the mayor does is he delegates his power away to the crowd to actually make these budgeting decisions. What you also see happening is that people just get so involved. People create projects, people get together. There's dialogues happening in the community, this interbeing that you were talking about. And so no one is no longer powerless. And so if somebody complains, just like in these self-managing organizations, it won't take very long for somebody to say, well, if you don't like it, in 3 months, you can submit your project. So why don't you go and submit your thing? And so that fundamentally alters the nature of the relationship. What I've just talked about, budgets, there's similar things happening around legislations or around regulations, or famous examples in Iceland where they crowd-wrote a whole new constitution that's been ranked very highly by legal scholars. And so there's all of these things happening in these different domains, which are really exciting.
Yeah, it's really curious. I've been interested in what seems like with participatory budgeting, it's almost like a step, right? Because then you still have the sort of mayor. The grown-ups are the last ones to decide. And I think what was really interesting about reinventing organizations, and at least some of the companies, like I think AES is one where you actually are the decision maker. So there's no one above you to sort of say yay or nay. I'm curious on the political side, have you seen anything like that? Rather than electing somebody else to make the decisions, it's actually the people who are making the decisions, but large groups of people?
There aren't examples of that yet because people still have to play within the existing system. But what it shows is that, so you have, areas where parliaments have basically outsourced their whole deliberation and proposal project. And we're still at the stage where, yes, the parliament has to rubber stamp it because that's just how our institutions are built up, right? But what I can totally see happening is as trust grows in these systems, people will come and say but what's then still the role of the parliament? Why do we still, need somebody to rubber stamp things when actually much more democratic process, has actually come up with great solutions, right? Or why do we actually still need a mayor who would, who has the formal power of actually invalidating something, So I think we're still certainly a whole number of years away from that realization. But the more we practice these things, right, the more we'll come to see that we actually don't need these grown-ups, as you call them, because the grown-ups are actually in the room deliberating and making decisions.
One other question on the book is, knowing what you know now, is there anything that you would have done differently in writing or the sort of launch of the book? I'm kind of curious your thoughts on that.
So yeah, there's a few companies that I wish I had known about, like, Decurion and Cafe Gratitude and these kind of things. But other than that, there's some areas where I feel like there's often misunderstandings that people have, around self-management. Like the standard misunderstanding is that self-management is a free-for-all. Like anybody can just do whatever they want. It's no processes, no practices, no structure. And so I feel like, have I not been clear enough? But then when I look in the book, like I don't think I could have said it more often than that, right? Like no, self-management. It's there are structures. It's just different structures, and they're still but maybe I wasn't clear enough, right? And also on sort of this piece that this evolutionary purpose. I think I could also maybe at times have been more clear that what I'm talking about is not so much organizations having a noble purpose. Like some people simply equate that with having a noble purpose, right? Which is not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is this notion that you no longer project things onto the organization. You no longer sort of try to predict and control the future for the organization. You're actually sort of constantly sensing and responding by listening to the purpose of the organization. And so some people sometimes, I think, still make a shortcut of thinking that just means having a noble purpose. And then we can still continue doing our 5-year plans and sort of, strategic planning in the old way, which is not what I was trying to convey. Because really, I think you've written an article about this, right? What Reinventing Organization talks about is really sort of the internal practices, is basically management, right? What I'm not really talking about is what these organizations do in the outside world. Like how much they participate in, regenerating, the biosphere and, what they do socially outside of the organization, which is, what B Corps, are about, and which is really the stuff that you're involved in these ways. These two things are very complementary, right? So what I was looking for was really mostly sort of the internal structures and practices.
What are you most excited about right now, either on a personal or professional level?
Actually, for the moment, I'm in part taking a step back because my wife is just so excited about a book she's writing, and it's all consuming to her. And so we've just decided, that's literally 2 weeks ago, that, we tend to have a pretty 50-50% split of task, that going forward for a number of months, I would do a disproportionate share of the task around the house and with the children, and so that she can focus as much as she can and wants on the writing. Other than that, I'm still excited to hear about organizations who are in their transition. And so one of the things that I think I might start doing relatively soon is maybe shoot a series of 50, 60 videos. So very simple. I'm just going to put a camera in front of me and shoot myself. And in sharing some of the lessons learned of organizations who are in this transition. I see some common pitfalls, some common mistakes, but I also see some brilliant things that I wouldn't have thought about. And so every time I hear from one of these organizations, I speak with CEO or a team in one of these organizations, I'm just so excited by what I see and learn. And so I have this whole list of things. And I think it could be a really powerful way to share some of those learnings. Because I'm tired of writing, I feel like these videos could be a very easy way for me to do this, and also a very easy way for people to share it. Like I could totally see somebody in an organization watching one of these short videos and going like, "Whoa, this is exactly sort of the trap that we're falling into. Hey guys, everyone needs to see it." And a video might then be a much easier way to share it than a new book. So that's one of the things that I will probably do next to the other things. I'm pretty involved here in my local little eco-village and spend a lot of time with my children. So there's very few hours I have. I'm trying to stay abreast somewhat with this overload of emails I receive, and maybe I will continue researching a bit on these new forms of political governance, and maybe that has a book in it at some point.
It's funny you mentioned video, and for me, this podcast came from being tired of writing because you can talk to someone and just sort of get the essence, and it's an interesting conversation as opposed to here, let me interview you, and I'll record it, and then I'll write it all down and synthesize it in an article. So I support your notion of doing something more visually or auditorially.
You were mentioning Charles Eisenstein before, who's this author that I also very highly respect. I think he just writes amazing things. And the other day I spent some time with one of his close friends and person who works with him, and she told me that he just writes something and his first draft is perfect, is immediately publishable. And I was so frustrated to hear that. I'm so jealous of that because that is so not my my strengths. I think my strength is in researching and in structuring, but the actual writing, it just takes me 3 or 4 rounds of edits before the thing is actually publishable, and it just takes so much time. And so when I heard that, and I suspected it because he just writes beautifully, and his writing is just crystal clear, and I almost suspected that this guy is just able to get his first draft perfect.
I remember listening to an interview with Michael Lewis, who wrote Hardball or Moneyball, about the baseball team who does sort of, they use computer algorithms to choose their best players. It is Flash Boys. And he said that once he does some initial research, but then he just writes, and it's so much fun for him. He has headphones and he's laughing to himself. I'm like, oh, I hate you. But I resonate with that. It's difficult writing. What about for folks who are curious, what's the book besides Reinventing Organizations that you most often give as a gift?
Oh, that's a good question, because I often buy sort of books in bulks just to give them away. So there's this author called Parker Palmer, who's this beautiful, wise old man. He's now in his 70s. And I just love everything he writes. Every sentence he writes is just perfect. It just stands on its own. And it's just, every sentence is just infused with so much wisdom, but also sort of humility and humor. And so he's written about community. He's written about the inner life. And there's a small book that he's written that's called Let Your Life Speak. And the subtitle is Listening to the Voice of Vocation. And it's just a wonderful book to offer people who are just unsure where they're meant to go, who might be for the first time at the stage where they ask that question differently, no longer in sort of a career perspective, but somehow feel that perspective is no longer interesting to them. But then wonder, what is it that, wants to happen? And he has this beautiful thing that he writes in there about that he understood at some point that he should stop wondering what life he's meant to live, but instead listen to the life that wants to be lived through him, which I think is just such a beautiful way of saying it. And so it's just a wonderful little book that's been sort of one of these slow but total bestsellers. So that's a book I give away quite a bit. In the same vein, I've given away another book called Working Identities. It's also around people who make fundamental career changes by a woman called Herminia Ibarra. I don't know why, but I seem to maybe that's just the age we're at in our 40s, but have a lot of people, contact me because they feel like they want to do something fundamentally different. And I've given away quite a few of Charles Eisenstein's books, Sacred Economics, as just a wonderful book around, how our whole monetary system, is meant to change, how, we might transition to something that looks more like the gift economy. And so for me, it's been usually impactful and inspirational. And most of the stuff that I do now is in the gift economy. Yeah, so that's some of the books that I like to give away.
Are there other thought leaders or folks that you look to as sort of this person or this organization is living the next economy or the sort of the future of business? Are there folks who are either individuals or organizations that come to mind that you look to for inspiration?
I gave you some of the names, so for instance, both Parker Palmer and Charles Eisenstein have been inspirational for me. Now that might be very specific for me, but as I'm suddenly sort of thrown into the world sort of as a public figure, right, as a sort of star in that admittedly really sort of narrow field of people who are interested in this, right, it's been interesting for me to see these two guys who continue leading very simple lives, right, because sort of the standard narrative or standard image that we have in our mind, and that certainly I see everybody sort of projecting onto me, is that everybody's expecting me now to spend my time in airplanes and travel all over the world and give as many speaking engagements as I can and cash in on the thing and create a successful consulting business on it, and because that's just our current story of more is better and more. So this is this is your big break, this is your big chance, and so that obviously didn't feel right to me or didn't feel like what I was called to live. And so in these sense, like people like Parker Palmer or Charles Eisenstein have been interesting people to look at. How have they dealt with it? And one thing that I'm always excited about is organizations who do really deep work and yet manage to do it on a massive scale, right? Something where sort of quality and quantity actually do meet. I'm impressed by, for instance, Parker Palmer's Center for Courage and Renewal that he's created, where he's had, I think, 50,000 or maybe 100,000 now teachers go through very deep retreats and just be fundamentally transformed as teachers, in the way that they teach in schools. And there's so many initiatives around schools, but so few that manage to scale. And so this is exciting for me. Or simply, the nonviolent communication. I've always been a huge fan of this, and when you just see what impact they're having in the world. And so I was totally honored and amazed when I heard that Reinventing Organizations was sort of one of the big inspirations for their reinvention for the Center of Nonviolent Communication. And they seem to be, if they really pull off sort of this new governance model that they have in plans, it's just going to be amazing. Or maybe, I don't know if you know the Mankind Project. It's this thing where this organization, nonprofit, that helps organize sort of rites of passages for men, with this idea that we've lost track of what sort of a healthy masculine is like. Right, in a narrative we no longer want sort of the bully, the man that that is close to his emotions, the macho man. But what is the alternative? Is it sort of this wimp? The man that always apologizes for everything, for all the crimes being done in the name of mankind, of man. And so they recognize that we're lacking a healthy idea of masculine. And they link that to the fact that we no longer have rites of passages that all traditional societies have. This moment when you're 15, 16, when you're being taught in very profound ways that, my son, now you're a man and you have these amazing powers that come with that strength, and now use it for the good. They've had now also, I think, something like 50,000 or 100,000 men around the world who've gone through these rites of passages. And I've done it. And every single man who's done it, I think, has found it that it was deeply transformative. So yeah, that was just like spontaneously something that came up. Is like, these organizations who manage to do really deep stuff at a large level. I find that very inspiring.
I'm glad you spoke about at least the Mankind. A friend of mine and actually we were just talking about that 2 weeks ago. Is what does it look like for the future of men to not be, how they've been for so long. And so I'll look into that. I'm really glad you mentioned that one. Maybe in the last few questions here, what do people never ask you that you wish they did?
So one question that comes to mind now, I'm talking specifically around people who are transforming organizations, inspired by Reinventing Organizations. And one thing I noticed that I find myself doing with them pretty much every time is having a profound conversation around, why do you feel called to do this? So the question, I guess, is, I would love someone to potentially ask me is like, help me understand why I'm doing this. It would be so much easier and safer to just do sort of not the traditional thing. Maybe not safer, but easier. And what I find is that people often, struggle to get others along, or at least aren't as powerful in getting other people in the organization along, because they haven't yet really connected very deeply with what it is that is calling them to do that thing, right? And so they throw out concept there. I think we should do self-management, and I think we should do this, and we should. And then it's very easy to sort of attack these concepts and say, but self-management is right for us, and we're not ready, and we're not. But once they've connected to sort of their profound yearning or their pain, and they connect to some stories, and sometimes they're stories, all along their lives, like even from childhood, where they found that some things were just shocking, and they become so incredibly powerful. It's really because they fuel from something deep inside, and everybody just notices it. Everybody resonates. Everybody wants to help and make that happen. And so this is, I think, really something profound I've noticed over the last few years in having these conversations. So I think really one interesting conversation that I'd invite people into, like people who listen to this podcast, if they're somewhere in a journey or just starting a journey to transform their organizations, before you do that, find a good friend, really deep, trusted friend, who's good at helping you sort things through, and ask that friend, why am I called to do this? And look for stories, not abstract concepts.
I love that. If we had another hour, I'd ask you. One of the last two questions here is, what do you need right now? We often ask guests, how can people help you grow this next economy?
By doing their thing and leaving me alone. No, I'm kidding.
By sending you lots of emails, right? No, just kidding.
Exactly. No, by just going out there and doing stuff. So what I've been trying to do is encourage other people to just go out there and do things. And one of the things that have happened, there's a whole newsletter and media hub called Enlivening Edge that has grown around the book. And one of the things is I haven't done anything for it. It's just people who felt that needed to happen, and they did it. And other people are doing meetups, and other people are creating, book clubs, and other people are doing CEO meetups. And I just encourage everyone to just go out there and do it. And I don't want this whole, the potential of all of this to be limited by sort of the few hours I can give it in a day. So by any means, go out there and make stuff happen. So
just for folks who would like more information, it's enliveningedge, I think, .org.
Yeah.
And then there's the Reinventing Organizations website. Maybe just a few of the websites that are
there's
more.
A website called Reinventing Organizations that has all of these links. There is a wiki called Reinventing Organizations Wiki, all in one word.com, that sort of details these practices. And there's a group of people who are starting to do research on more organizations to fill the wiki with more knowledge. But the idea is to have sort of a central repository with more details than the book can have on each of these practices. Okay, so how do you make decisions in these organizations, and what do you do about budgets? And so I think that's a wonderful resource. And then I think the most important thing that needs to happen right now is that we share more stories. So I think that we're at this sort of tipping point for the narrative to change. Right. So when you talk about now organizations of thousands of people and no hierarchy whatsoever in a traditional sense, only natural hierarchies, no bosses, no subordinates, today that still sounds crazy. But the first time you read an article about an organization who does that and that is really successful, you go like, what? And the organization is successful? That sounds crazy. But the second time you read about that, you go like, that's interesting, so that's maybe not so crazy, right? And then the third or fifth time you go like, that just becomes part of the narrative, right? And maybe at some point, we'll have a tipping point where people go like, so you still have like a hierarchy, you still have a pyramid? Oh, okay, that's okay, And so I think one of the most urgent tasks right now is to write and write and write. And so I just love to see journalists, go out there and write things, and they can actually contact me, and I will respond and give the names of organizations to research. But I'd also love to invite organizations who are in the middle of their transformation to write about it and write blogs about it. There's one or two organizations who've done that, Buffer and Fitzy, sort of smaller tech organizations. And they've had quite a following of people really following along. And so that to me seems the most crucial part. So yeah, taking back to your question, that's I think what people really can do to sort of further this movement.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.